Hi everyone, so for our debate, we're going to be talking about carbon tax and more specifically what the US and what the Canada think of carbon tax, their history behind it, and the conclusion we've come to in terms of if carbon tax is good or a bad thing and what works best for each country. Before we start a debate between countries, we're going to talk about what actually is carbon tax. So carbon tax is basically a core policy that plans to eliminate and reduce fossil fuels who basically are destroying our climate, also called greenhouse gas emissions. So basically carbon tax essentially has the users of fossil fuels pay a tax for using the type of fuel, which funds go back into reducing greenhouse gases and overall supports climate change policies for the country that it is implemented in, or state, province, or municipality. Now we're going to go into a little bit of the background and the history of carbon tax in Canada as well as the US, how they are similar and how they are different. Now we're going to go into a little bit of the history Canada has with carbon tax. Canada is the world's 10th largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Canada's carbon tax history began in March of 2007 when Alberta became North America's first jurisdiction to legislate greenhouse gas reductions from large industrial emitters via a carbon levy. Following the introduction of this policy in Alberta in 2008 federal election, the Conservative and Liberal leaders both included carbon tax pricing in their platforms, the first time ever this happened in Canadian history. Fast forward to more recently, in the 2015 election, at the time, Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced plans for a national carbon pricing plan that included several provinces, but excluding the ones that already had their own provincial carbon tax. After Justin Trudeau announced the federal pricing carbon taxing plan, it came into effect on April 1st, 2019, and it applied to Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick. These provinces did not adopt their own carbon taxes, therefore they were under the federal carbon tax plans and the cap and trade plan. Now we're going to talk about a bit of the history of carbon tax in the United States and how that's different to Canada. The United States of America is ranked second in the world after China for the most greenhouse gases emitted per country. Unlike Canada, that is number 10, obviously the United States produces a lot more greenhouse gases, but again, they do have a larger population. Unlike Canada, the US has never had any carbon taxes passed through federally. Therefore, there isn't much of a background of history when it comes to carbon tax, as it's still a hot topic trickling through Congress as we speak. Although federally nothing has passed, certain states have created their own carbon taxes, just like certain provinces did before the federal carbon tax came into place in 2015, as well as certain states have cap and trade policies as well. To reiterate, carbon tax proposals have been introduced in Congress for the past several years without success. The economic implications of taxing pollution are well understood by politicians, but there are a lot of people who think that it will harm the energy sector and people will lose jobs. As mentioned before, there isn't a federal carbon tax in the US, but 11 states that are home to about a quarter of the US population do have carbon pricing programs that are currently helping them to reduce greenhouse gases. Some of these states include California, Connecticut, Delaware, New York, Rhode Island, Vermont, and more. As mentioned in 2007, the first time carbon tax pricing came up in the Alberta legislature, something similar happened in the US, but it happened on a federal level. So the Clinton administration in 1993 proposed the BTU tax, basically a tax that would tax all sorts of energy based on their heat content except for wind, solar, and geothermal. This didn't actually pass through the House or the Senate and ended up actually having a really big impact on the Clinton administration. And from then on, because of the mess of the policy, people were very, very scared to vote in favor of carbon taxes. Lastly, it's important to note that the citizens of Boulder, Colorado in 2006 actually became the first municipality ever in North America to create their own carbon tax, which funds go back into their city to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Now we're going to get into the debate part and start off with the question, what does the US think about carbon tax and what does Canada think about carbon tax? With this, we're going to compare both sides and see which country and why they decide to support or not support carbon tax. So the first question we're going to start off with in our debate is, why does Canada support carbon tax and why does the US not? So Canada's side, so a defining feature of carbon tax is that it can actually raise revenue. So this revenue can be used for a number of purposes, including using carbon tax revenue funds as a reduction in other taxes in the economy, such as taxes on personal or corporate income or payroll taxes, as well as an escalating carbon price would allow GDP to grow significantly. So now for the US, the reason why the US doesn't want to support a carbon tax is mainly because they feel that if they raise the prices of taxes for using carbon, it will affect the way that the economy works in terms of food or delivering goods and services, and then those prices will go up, and overall energy will cost more, but so will the goods and services. They rely on the energy to show up in local markets, including food, so they think that it won't be a revenue that would be worth contributing to that economic factor for. Our next debate question is, are there ways to completely avoid all competitiveness concerns? So on the US side, another problem is that carbon taxes would hamper the international competitiveness of the US firms that either produce or rely on fossil fuels. So many US trading partners do not adapt carbon taxes. So for example, China, the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, has no such mechanism in place, and the US adoption of carbon taxes could harm the US companies or even induce them to move to countries where these fees are non-existent, causing job losses, reducing investment, and possibly lowering economic growth. As for Canada's side on the issue, we can't talk about competitiveness without recognizing many policies that affect it. Corporate taxes, investment rules, labor laws, building codes, and so on. There are equally many ways to improve competitiveness, increase productivity, liberalize markets, improve labor mobility and work incentives, again, modernize the corporate tax system, drop investment restrictions, ease regulations, and so on. So that's how Canada can combat the competitiveness in terms of carbon taxing. The last debate question we're going to be talking about is, does this imply carbon pricing is a bad policy? So no, this does not imply that carbon pricing is a bad policy, even though the US is very against carbon taxes and in many states, as well as federally right now. So in Canada's defense, the Climate Action Plan payments enable the government to encourage lower greenhouse gas emissions without imposing a financial burden onto households. That's even more, as well as households in Ontario will receive more in climate action incentive payments than they incur in total costs resulting from pollution pricing. In relation to the US side and what they think about carbon tax, I think it wouldn't be the same as the liberal values that Canada has in terms of wanting to put a price on pollution. So for the US, a couple analysts from the Heritage Foundation found that in order to lower greenhouse gas emissions by 2040 with a carbon tax, this would result in a peak employment shortfall of more than 1.4 million jobs, total income loss of more than $40,000 for a family of four, GDP loss, as well as electricity expenditure. So our last debate question, now on to the conclusion of what the United States thinks about carbon taxing. So today, both parties are largely silent on the idea. So that means Republicans and Democrats. Earlier this year, House Republicans vowed to address rising greenhouse gas levels by planting 1 million trees. But President Donald Trump famously called climate change a Chinese hoax and has moved to withdraw the United States from the landmark Paris Climate Agreement. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party has cast carbon pricing aside in favor of more ambitious large-scale ideas. The party's presidential nominee, Joe Biden, has proposed a massive $2 trillion package that would eliminate emissions from the electricity sector by 2035, but stopped short of recommending a carbon tax. Therefore, it appears that America will not get a carbon tax plan anytime soon. Now it's the outcome of Canada and carbon pricing. So in comparison, as recently as March 2020, Prime Minister Trudeau's words indicated that carbon tax is not going anywhere. It's important to mention that carbon tax is a central pillar of the Liberals' climate change agenda. But appeals courts in Saskatchewan and Ontario ruled in 2019 that the federal carbon tax legislation was constitutional, but in February of this year, the Alberta Court of Appeal said it was not. In September 2020, the Supreme Court of Canada reserved judgment on the national carbon tax. After 2 days of hearings and presentations from more than 24 interested parties, the court adjourned without yet deciding whether the carbon tax was constitutional. A decision could take several more months.